Get your hands off those boarding passes, Derek Holloway snarled, snatching the phones right out of the girls' hands before they could even finish showing him the screen because first class isn't for people like you, and it never will be. But we'll get back to that moment in just a minute because to understand what happened next, to understand why every single Apex Airways flight in the country went dark on that Tuesday morning, why 52,000 passengers found themselves stranded in terminals from Atlanta to Seattle, why a man who hadn't raised his voice in a boardroom in 11 years picked up a phone and issued an order that shook an entire industry to its foundation. You need to start earlier, much earlier, in a penthouse apartment on the 39th floor of a building in downtown Atlanta, where a man woke up at 4:30 in the morning without an alarm, the way he had every single morning for the past 24 years. Nathan Ellis opened his eyes in the dark and lay still for exactly 30 seconds, which was all he ever allowed himself, before his mind started moving, before the numbers came fuel costs and passenger projections and load factors and the quarterly review that was scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning, the one he had been dreading for 3 weeks. Because the labor negotiation numbers were ugly and the board was going to have questions he didn't have clean answers to yet. He sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his hands together in the dark. A habit so old he no longer noticed he was doing it, and if you had looked closely at his hands in that moment, you would have seen something that didn't quite belong on a man who wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent calluses. Old ones. The kind that have been pressed into skin so many times over so many years that they never fully go away, not even after 2 decades behind a desk, not even after you've stopped loading cargo in the Georgia summer heat and started sitting in rooms where people pour your coffee for you. Those calluses told the whole story of Nathan Ellis, or at least the part of the story that most people who saw him now didn't know and wouldn't have guessed. He had started at Apex Airways 24 years ago as a baggage handler at Hartsfield-Jackson, 22 years old, wearing an orange safety vest that was 2 sizes too big working in heat, so punishing that by noon the tarmac shimmered like something alive, and the inside of his gloves felt like they'd been soaked in warm water from the moment he put them on at 5 in the morning until he peeled them off at the end of a 12-hour shift, his palms raw, his shoulders burning in a way that didn't fully stop even in his sleep. He had been invisible in that job, genuinely, completely invisible in the particular way that people in service positions are invisible to the passengers. They serve meaning that the travelers in the first-class cabin whose bags he loaded with such care that not a single item was ever damaged didn't see him. Not really. Not as a person with a name and a mind and a plan, just as a background detail, part of the machinery of getting from one place to another, as unremarkable and unnoticed as the conveyor belts and the fuel trucks and the blinking lights on the runway. He had studied for his MBA on cafeteria tables in the Apex break room, between shifts, textbooks propped against a paper coffee cup highlighter in hand, reading about organizational management and financial strategy, while the smell of industrial cleaner and reheated food hung in the air around him, and his co-workers talked about the game, not one of them knowing or needing to know what he was planning, what he was building, what he could already see from where he was standing, even if nobody else could see it yet. It had taken him 24 years. Ramp agent, then ground crew supervisor, then operations coordinator, then regional director of the Southeast Corridor, then VP of operations, then COO, then 5 years ago. The call that changed everything, the board's offer, the vote, the title that no black man had ever held in Apex Airways' 58-year history. CEO. He stood at the kitchen window now with his first coffee of the morning and looked out at the Atlanta skyline and felt, as he always felt in these quiet minutes before the day officially began, the full weight of the distance between where he had started and where he was standing. A distance so enormous that on certain mornings it didn't feel entirely real, and on other mornings it felt realer than anything else in his life. His phone lit up on the counter. A text from Layla sent at 6:47. A photo of his twin daughters standing in front of Imani's bedroom mirror. Both of them in matching outfits. Thumbs up Layla's face, split in a grin wide enough to light a room. Imani's smile, quieter, but just as bright, and below the photo, 3 words were ready, Dad. Nathan Ellis looked at that photo for a long moment, and it was the first genuine smile he had allowed himself in days, unguarded and complete, the smile of a man who has built something enormous and knows that none of it means anything compared to the 2 people in that photograph. He typed back what he always typed. Be safe. Call when you land. Don't tell anyone who your dad is. He set the phone down, drank his coffee, and watched the city wake up below him, completely unaware that the day he was about to have would become the most important day of his career and theirs. The secret had been a decision, not an accident, and Nathan had made it deliberately and carefully when the twins were 4 years old, long before there was anything significant to keep secret back when he was still a regional director. And the idea of becoming CEO was something he thought about only in the most private corners of his ambition. He had watched what happened to the children of executives, the way they walked through the world with a particular kind of ease that he recognized as both a gift and a limitation. The ease of people who have never had to wonder whether a door will open for them, because the doors in their experience have always opened, and so they never develop the specific muscle that comes from having to push, from having to prove, from having to walk into a room knowing that half the people in it have already decided you don't belong there, and choosing to stay anyway. He didn't want that for Layla and Imani. His wife Renata had argued with him about it more than once. Not fighting Renata didn't fight. She reasoned carefully and clearly, standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, and her expression patient but firm, and her argument was always the same. Nathan keeping this from them doesn't protect them. It just means they go out into the world without the full picture of who they are and where they come from, and when they find out, and they will find out, they're going to wonder why you thought you had to hide it from them. And Nathan had looked up from his laptop every time and said the same thing. When they find out, they'll understand I'm not hiding anything from them. Renata, I'm giving them something. I'm giving them a chance to see the world as it really is before they see it as it could be. Renata had never stopped worrying about this decision, and Nathan had known she was worrying even when she stopped bringing it up, because Renata's worry had a particular quality. It didn't make noise, it just changed the temperature. In a room, slightly made the air a degree or 2 heavier, and Nathan had learned to read that temperature the way he read everything else, with precision and without comment. So Layla and Imani Ellis knew that their father worked in aviation management. They knew he traveled frequently, had an important office somewhere downtown, took calls that sometimes required him to step into another room and close the door, and occasionally came home from trips looking like he was carrying something heavy that wasn't in any of his bags. They had told friends he probably handled scheduling, or maybe something to do with routes. One of Imani's classmates had expressed genuine sympathy. That sounds like a pretty stressful job. All that coordination, and Imani had agreed that it probably was. The line Nathan gave them, "Don't tell anyone who your dad is," had become a family joke over the years, delivered with an exaggerated, serious face received with twin eye rolls, and the specific sighing tolerance that teenagers reserve for the things their parents say that are technically harmless, but persistently embarrassing. And both girls had long assumed it was his way of reminding them to be humble, to not trade on whatever modest professional reputation he had in the aviation world. They had absolutely no idea he meant it literally. Nathan poured a second coffee, checked the board meeting agenda on his tablet, thought briefly about the labor negotiation figures, set the tablet down, picked up his phone and looked at the photo of his daughters one more time before sliding the phone into his pocket and heading for the shower. He thought, as he sometimes did on mornings like this, they'll understand when they find out. He didn't think, because he couldn't have known they were going to find out today. Across Atlanta, in the bedroom that Imani had claimed as her own since she was 9 years old, and decorated in a way that reflected precisely who she was. Shelves of paperbacks organized by color, a corkboard pinned with track meet schedules and honor roll certificates, and one postcard of the MIT campus that she had ordered online and stared at so many times the corners had gone soft. Layla Ellis was holding up a blazer and making a face. "Too formal," Imani said, not looking up from the journal she was writing and cross-legged on her bedpen, moving in the steady, unhurried way it always did when she was thinking clearly, which was most of the time. "It's a college tour, not a job interview," Layla agreed, dropping the blazer back onto the pile on the chair that had been accumulating outfit options since 6 that morning, which was 30 minutes before she had knocked on Imani's door and announced that they needed to start getting ready immediately, because she had a feeling, and she always trusted her feelings about timing. Imani did not always trust feelings about timing because Imani trusted things she could write down and examine things that held up under the specific pressure of her own careful attention. But she trusted Layla, which amounted to the same thing in practice. They had been this way their entire lives. Layla, the fire Imani, the water. Layla, the one who walked into a room first and spoke first and stood her ground first. Imani, the one who stood in the doorway for a moment and read the room before entering it, who watched people with the quiet attentiveness of someone who understood that what people don't say is usually more important than what they do, who kept a leather-bound journal that she had been writing in every single day since the first week of freshman year, filling page after page with observations and questions and the kind of precise emotional accounting that most people can't manage, even in their own heads, let alone on paper. Where Layla was urgency, Imani was patience. Where Imani was stillness, Layla was motion. Together, they balanced each other so completely that people who met them for the first time often commented on it, usually saying something about yin and yang or two sides of a coin, and Layla would nod politely while Imani wrote about it later in her journal, noting with characteristic precision that people reach for metaphors about duality when what they actually mean is that they're surprised two people can be genuinely different and still be genuinely close. They were both National Honor Society. Both varsity track Layla ran the 400, Imani the 800. Both volunteered at an after-school literacy program on Saturday mornings, which had been Imani's idea initially and which Layla had adopted with characteristic all-in energy, showing up every week with activities planned and snacks in her bag. Layla carried a 4.3 GPA. Imani carried a 4.2. Both of them had been working toward this college tour for the better part of 2 years, researching programs, attending virtual information sessions, emailing admissions offices with the carefully composed questions that signaled to any reader that the student on the other end of that email was serious, prepared, and had already thought about things most applicants wouldn't consider until their second year. The first-class tickets had arrived in their email inboxes 3 weeks ago from their father with a message that said simply, "You've earned this. Have the best time. Don't tell anyone who your dad is." And then a string of laughing emojis that somehow made the last line seem even more like a joke than it already did. Their mother, Renata, drove them to Hartsfield-Jackson in the gray pre-morning light. The freeway almost empty at this hour, and she gave them the instructions that she gave them every time they went anywhere without her. The maternal rapid fire that covered everything from keeping their IDs in their front pocket to not leaving their bags unattended to calling when they got through security, and calling when they boarded, and calling the moment the wheels touched down in Chicago, the layover before Boston. "Mom," Layla said from the back seat, "we're going to Boston, not the moon." "I don't care if you're going to the mailbox," Renata said. "You call me." She pulled up to the departures terminal and put the car in park and sat there for a moment before turning around to look at them. Really, look at them, both of them, in matching outfits that they had arrived at after 40 minutes of deliberation, and that managed somehow to look both effortless and intentional, the way everything they did together looked when they were paying attention to it. Renata's eyes were soft and full of something she didn't let reach her face completely, something that had lived in her chest since the moment they were born, and that only grew heavier as they grew older and more themselves and more ready for a world that she loved them too much not to worry about. "I am so proud of you two," she said quietly. "Whatever happens today, whatever happens on this trip, remember who you are. You are Ellis girls, and Ellis girls don't back down from anything." They leaned forward and kissed her cheek, one on each side, grabbed their bags, stepped out onto the curb, and walked through the revolving doors of Hartsfield-Jackson Airport like they owned every square foot of it. They didn't know yet that they were walking into the worst morning of their lives. Hartsfield-Jackson was already running at full morning velocity when they walked in the organized chaos of a major hub in the first hours of the day. Business travelers cutting through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this 1,000 times. Families navigating the particular logistical nightmare of air travel with small children, college kids in hoodies and headphones moving in loose clusters toward their gates, the whole enormous human machine of it humming at a frequency that felt almost like music if you listened the right way. Layla and Imani made their way to the Apex Airways first-class check-in counter with their boarding passes already pulled up on their phone seats, confirmed 2A and 2B. Their names clear on the screen. Flight number, departure time. Everything exactly in order, the way they had checked it the night before. And again that morning, partly out of the practical caution that Imani applied to everything that mattered, and partly out of the specific kind of excitement that makes you want to confirm a thing is real by looking at it again and again. The agent behind the counter looked up when they stepped to the front of the line. His name tag read, Derek Holloway. He was mid-40s with sandy blonde hair that had retreated significantly from his temples and a face that was arranged into the default expression of someone who had been in customer service long enough to develop a smile that existed entirely on the surface, that activated when required and switched off. The moment it wasn't leaving behind an expression that was not quite neutral and not quite anything else, but that communicated, if you were paying attention, a readiness to be displeased. He looked at the girls. The shift in his expression was small, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional rearrangement of his features, but Layla caught it immediately and completely because she had been catching that particular shift her entire life in teachers and store clerks and men in parking lots and strangers on elevators. The microsecond recalibration that happened when someone looked at her and Imani and revised whatever assumption they had been operating on and not upward. "Can I help you?" Derek said, and the way he said it communicated clearly and without any room for misinterpretation that he hoped the answer required minimal effort on his part. Layla stepped forward, phone extended boarding pass visible on the screen. "Hi, we're checking in for Apex Flight 147 to Chicago. We have our boarding passes already, but we just wanted to confirm our seats." Derek glanced at the screen. Then he looked at Layla. Then he looked at Imani. Then he looked back at Layla, and the shift in his expression completed itself into something that was no longer ambiguous. "First class?" he said flatly. "Yes, sir," Imani said. Derek leaned back slightly in his chair and crossed his arms in a way that he probably believed looked like standard professional skepticism, and that looked to both girls like something else entirely. "And how did you two come by first-class tickets on this route? These are full-fare seats. They run about $3,800 each." The heat started in Layla's chest the moment the question was finished. Not fear something hotter than fear something that had a shape and a history and a name she had known for years. "Our father purchased them," she said, keeping her voice level. "They're booked under our names. You can see them right there on the screen." Derek did not look at the screen again. He looked at their clothes, their bags, their faces, and made the calculations he was making with the specific efficiency of someone who had made them many times before and had long since stopped examining them. "I'm going to need to see some additional identification," he said. Imani was already reaching into her bag. She produced her state ID and slid it across the counter without comment. Layla did the same. Derek picked up both IDs, held them up to the light with the deliberate slowness of someone performing thoroughness as a demonstration rather than an actual process, set them down, and began typing into his computer with the particular measured pace of a man who understands that making someone wait is its own form of power. Behind them, a white couple in their early 60s stepped to the adjacent counter. The agent there greeted them with a warm and genuine smile. Their boarding passes were scanned, their documents, checked their bags, tagged their boarding passes, printed, the whole transaction completed in under 90 seconds. Cheerful goodbyes exchanged on both sides, and they were gone, rolling their luggage toward security, already deep in conversation about something that had nothing to do with being questioned. Layla watched every second of this happen. The heat in her chest moved into her throat. "I'm going to need you to step aside while I verify these tickets with my supervisor," Derek said, and the words arrived with the smoothness of a line that had been used before, worn comfortable by repetition, carrying beneath its surface the clear implication that compliance was the only reasonable response and that anything else would create a situation that nobody wanted. "We've been standing here for 10 minutes, Layla said. "Everyone else in this line has been processed in 2. Miss, I'm asking you to step aside. If you refuse, I'll need to call security." The word security landed differently than Derek probably intended it to, or perhaps exactly as he intended it to. Not as a neutral logistical option, but as a lever, a pressure point, a reminder of what the consequences looked like for 2 black girls who decided that their patience had limits in a public space where patience was the only currency they were permitted to spend. Imani touched Layla's arm, just the lightest pressure of her fingers, the specific signal that had been their private language since they were small, and Layla felt it and understood it and took a breath that lasted longer than it needed to, and they stepped aside. They stood beside the counter and waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15. Passengers came and went around them in a steady stream, processed efficiently and warmly, sent on their way with smiles and good wishes and not a single additional question about where they'd gotten their tickets or whether their identification was genuine. A family of 5 parents. 3 kids, the youngest, maybe 4 years old and carrying a stuffed elephant that was missing. 1 eye. Moved through in under 3 minutes, the agent laughing at something the father said, the mother collecting the boarding passes with one hand while managing the stuffed elephant with the other. Derek did not look at the twins once during those 15 minutes. Not once. He processed his line, answered questions, made small talk, and moved through his morning as though Layla and Imani Ellis did not exist in the space 6 feet to his left, as though they were something to be managed later, or not at all a problem he had already solved by making them wait long enough that they might simply give up and go away. Imani pulled her journal out of her bag and wrote. She wrote about the family with the 5-eyed stuffed elephant. She wrote about the sound of the departure board clicking over to a new set of times. She wrote about the specific quality of being made invisible in a public space, the way it pressed on the chest from the outside rather than the inside, a pressure applied by other people's choices, other people's decisions about who counted and who didn't. Writing was the thing she had always done when the world became too loud or too heavy or too wrong, because the act of turning an experience into words gave her some measure of authority over it, made it something she was examining rather than simply enduring. Layla stood straight arms at her sides, watching Derek with an expression that showed absolutely nothing of what she was feeling, which was the specific discipline of a girl who has learned early and thoroughly that showing what you feel in situations like this one gives the person creating the situation exactly what they want. When Derek finally called them back, he announced that their tickets checked out with the magnanimous air of a man completing an act of generosity as though he had gone above and beyond on their behalf, rather than having wasted 20 minutes of their time performing a suspicion he had decided upon before he typed a single keystroke. He handed over their boarding passes without eye contact. Gate C14 boarding begins in 35 minutes. Layla took the boarding pass from his hand. There were 17 things she wanted to say, and she said none of them because Imani was already moving, and because the most devastating thing she could do to Derek Holloway in that moment was refuse to give him the reaction he had been engineering for 20 minutes, and she knew it. And so she turned, and they walked, their sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, neither of them speaking for a full 60 seconds. "That wasn't protocol," Layla said finally, her voice low and tight in the way it got when she was working to keep it from becoming something else. "I know," Imani said. "He looked at us and decided we didn't deserve those seats before we said a single word." "I know. And everyone in that line watched it happen and nobody said anything. Not one person." Imani didn't respond to that, and the silence between them was not absence but presence. The presence of something they had both grown up hearing about in their parents' stories and their grandparents' stories, and the history books and the news. And now here it was, made entirely real, made entirely theirs. The silence of bystanders who have decided that other people's dignity is not their problem. They walked toward the TSA security checkpoint, and Layla thought about the college tour and Harvard and MIT and Boston, and she tried to hold on to the excitement that had felt so complete just 2 hours ago in her sister's bedroom, and she could still find it. But it had been moved, pushed to a back corner of her chest by something heavier, something older, something that she recognized the shape of, even if she had never worn it quite this way before. The TSA security line was long, but moving the way lines at Hartsfield-Jackson always moved in the morning rush, a steady compression and release, people peeling off toward the scanners in groups of 2 and 3. The conveyor belts running constantly. The officers on the other side working through the flow with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this 10,000 times and have developed a rhythm for it. Layla went through the body scanner first. The machine registered her in approximately 2 seconds. Green light. Clear. She stepped through, collected her bag from the belt, moved to the side to wait. Imani stepped into the scanner. The machine registered her. Green light. Clear. She was reaching for her bag on the conveyor when a TSA officer stepped forward and stopped her. The officer's name tag read Victoria Strand. She was somewhere in her late 40s, with a platinum blonde ponytail pulled so tight it seemed to be doing some of the work. Her expression was also doing a jaw already. Set eyes already decided the body language of someone who has not just reached a conclusion, but has been at that conclusion for a while, and is simply now letting it become visible. She was wearing the uniform of federal authority, and she wore it with the particular comfort of someone who has learned that the uniform and the authority are the same thing. "I need to do an additional screening," Victoria said, pointing at Imani's carry-on bag where it sat on the belt. Imani turned to look at her. "What? Why?" "The scanner cleared me. Random selection." Layla stepped back toward her sister. "We both went through the scanner. We both cleared. This is not random." Victoria's expression did not change by a single degree. "Ma'am, I need you to step over here. If you refuse, I'll need to call my supervisor, and it will take considerably longer." There it was again, the same lever Derek Holloway had reached for 40 minutes earlier. The same embedded threat, dressed in the same administrative language, the message identical in both cases: cooperate, or we make it worse. It was the oldest script in the world, and it worked precisely because the alternative it implied was real, and both girls knew it. They stepped to the side screening area. Victoria pulled on a pair of blue latex gloves. The snap of the latex as they cleared her wrists was sharp and definitive, louder somehow than it should have been, or maybe it just felt that way because of what it preceded. She opened Imani's carry-on bag and began removing the contents one at a time, setting each item on the steel table with movements that were deliberate and unhurried, a practiced performance of official purpose. A textbook for AP Environmental Science, a phone charger coiled inside a small zippered pocket, a bag of trail mix, a folded track meet schedule from the previous month, a spare hoodie rolled into a tight cylinder, a small toiletry bag, And then the journal. Victoria held it up. It was the journal Imani had been writing in every day since freshman year. Leather cover dark brown, the spine cracked in the particular way that books crack when they are opened daily, when they are used the way they are meant to be used when they matter to the person who uses them. Victoria turned it over once looking at the cover. Then she opened it and began reading. Not scanning, not checking for concealed items. Reading. Page after page, her eyes moving across Imani's handwriting, the entries dated, the observations careful and precise, the kind of private accounting that a person does for themselves alone, never expecting anyone else's eyes to find it. Imani stood perfectly still. Outside she was composed, face, neutral hands at her sides, breathing even, and controlled the stillness of someone who has decided that stillness is the only safe response available to her. In this specific moment, in this specific room, with this specific audience watching. Outside, she was doing the thing she had been taught to do by every experience that had ever required it hold together. Don't react. Don't give them the thing they're waiting for you to give them. Inside, she was noticing the overhead lights, the fluorescent kind slightly too bright, the kind that make everything look like evidence. She was noticing the sound of the conveyor belt on the main line continuing without her, the mechanical indifference of it. She was noticing a child in the next lane watching with large eyes, maybe 7 years old, holding a stuffed animal, not sure what she was seeing, but understanding somehow that it was something. She was noticing that the words on those pages were hers, her actual thoughts, her private examinations of the world, the things she had written down, because writing them down was how she made sense of being alive, and they were being held up and read by a stranger in blue gloves in front of everyone in this checkpoint, as though they were not thoughts at all, but evidence of something that hadn't been named yet. Layla saw it too. She watched Victoria turn the pages of her sister's journal, and felt the heat she had been managing since the check-in counter escalate past the point where management was a useful word for it into something that had a different quality entirely, something that radiated outward from her chest until her fingertips felt charged with it. She looked around the checkpoint. She looked at the people in the main line, some of whom were glancing over with the cautious sideways attention of people watching something. They're not sure they should watch, some of whom were deliberately not looking in the way that requires active effort. Some of whom had the unmistakable expression of people who are relieved that whatever is happening over there is happening over there, and not to them. And then she saw the girl, a white girl roughly their age, maybe a year older, walking through the scanner in the main lane with a designer backpack and a phone in her hand. The earbuds in, not looking up the scanner, registering her. In 2 seconds, green light. Clear her bag coming off the belt without anyone touching it. Without a single blue-gloved hand reaching toward it. Without anyone asking her a question, or stopping her movement, or suggesting that her presence in this checkpoint required any additional examination at all. She just walked through. It took 10 seconds. Ends. She was gone. Imani saw it. Layla saw it. Their eyes met above Victoria Strand's bent head, and the look that passed between them was a whole conversation. Not a new conversation, not a surprising one, but the one they had been raised to understand was coming. The one their parents had tried to prepare them for, the one their grandparents had described from their own lives with the particular careful tone of people trying to equip their grandchildren for a reality they wish were not real. Victoria finished her search, finding, of course, absolutely nothing, because there was absolutely nothing to find, and re-zipped the bag and slid it across the table without a word. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that she had just spent 5 minutes reading a 17-year-old girl's private journal in front of a crowd of strangers for no reason that would hold up to the most basic scrutiny. Imani picked up her bag. Layla picked up hers. They walked away from the checkpoint in silence, and neither of them spoke until they had turned a corner and were in the open concourse, and the noise of the checkpoint had faded behind them. Something had changed between them. Not in their relationship that was as solid as it had ever been, but in something each of them was carrying something that had been added to what they already knew about the world, a specific and undeniable weight that felt, if they were honest, disturbingly familiar, like a thing they had always known was coming and had now arrived. They found seats at gate C-14 and sat without speaking for 2 full minutes, which was not unusual for them. Layla and Imani had always been comfortable in each other's silence, had always understood that the space between words was not empty but full, and that sometimes full silence was the most honest response to a thing that had happened. It was Imani who broke it. "Call him?" she said, and she said it quietly without drama, looking straight ahead at the departure board, where their flight was still listed as on time. The orderly green letters, an almost absurd contrast to the morning they had just had. Layla had been holding her phone since they sat down. She had been waiting, she realized, for exactly this not permission, because Imani didn't grant permission, but alignment, the confirmation that they were reading the same situation the same way, which they almost always were. She scrolled to her father's contact and pressed call. In his office on the 39th floor of Apex Airways headquarters in downtown Atlanta, Nathan Ellis was reviewing the labor negotiation briefing on his tablet with the focused attention of a man who is trying to locate a clean answer in a document that does not contain one when his phone lit up on the corner of his desk, with Layla's face smiling at him from the caller ID, the Christmas photo from 2 years ago, her grin enormous. Eyes bright, a paper crown slightly askew on her head from some dinner game that had devolved beautifully. He almost let it go to voicemail. The board meeting was in 16 minutes. His CFO was already in the conference room. The briefing was on page 3 of 12, and he hadn't liked page 2. Something made him pick up. Call it fatherhood. Call it the particular antenna that parents develop for the specific frequency of their children's distress, the one that operates below the level of conscious decision and simply sends a signal when it needs to be heard. Call it the fact that Renata's words from breakfast that morning, their 2 black girls flying first class alone. Nathan, you know what that looks like to some people? Had not, as it turned out fully, left his mind the way he had told himself they would, once the day got moving. He answered, "Hey, baby girl." "You, at the airport." He heard it immediately. The crack in her voice so small that anyone who didn't know Layla the way he knew her would have missed it entirely. The fracture in a voice that was working to hold itself together and not quite succeeding the sound of a 17-year-old girl who has decided she is going to be fine and has not yet managed to convince herself completely. "Dad," Layla said. Something happened. Nathan Ellis sat up straight in his chair. The labor negotiation briefing on his tablet stopped existing. The board meeting in 16 minutes stopped existing. The labor costs and the quarterly review and the West Coast expansion that he had been turning over in his mind since 4:30 that morning, all of it simply stopped, replaced by a single point of absolute focus that narrowed to the sound of his daughter's voice. "Tell me everything he said." And she did. Layla told him about Derek Holloway, about the way he had looked at them before he spoke a single word, about the question he asked about where they'd gotten their tickets, about the way he held their IDs up to the light like he was checking for counterfeiting, about the 20 minutes they stood to the side while every other passenger in the line was processed with warmth and efficiency and without a single additional question. She told him about the white couple who went through in 90 seconds, chat and smiles, and have a wonderful flight, and she heard her father's breathing change when she described that, a slight deepening, a tightening, but he didn't interrupt, and so she kept going. She told him about the TSA checkpoint, about Victoria Strand, about the blue gloves, the specific snapping sound of them, and about the way Victoria had gone through Imani's bag piece by piece, like she was conducting an investigation. And then she got to the journal, and she heard her father go completely still on the other end of the line, the stillness of a man who has stopped moving in order to hear something with his whole body. And then she said the thing that hit Nathan harder than everything that had come before. Hit harder than the 20 minutes of waiting and the additional ID request, and the checkpoint, and all of it. The thing she said that found the specific place in him where his love for his daughters lived and pressed directly on it without mercy. Dad? She went through Imani's journal. Her actual journal, her private words, the things she writes for herself, right there in front of everyone. And Imani just stood there and let it happen. Because we both knew Dad. We both knew that if either of us said anything, if we raised our voices even a little, if we showed anything, we'd be the ones in trouble. We'd be the angry black girls making a scene, and that's what they wanted. They wanted us to react so they could tell themselves they were right about us. Nathan Ellis closed his eyes. He pressed the phone against his ear so hard the edge of it was uncomfortable against his temple, but he didn't move it. 24 years. 24 years of early mornings and late nights and missed events and meetings that ran into each other and decisions that cost him sleep, and a career built from the ground up through every invisible job this industry had ever offered him until it had no choice but to offer him its highest position, and his daughters. His daughters had just been treated like criminals inside his airline, inside his company under his name, by people wearing uniforms that bore the logo he had spent 5 years as CEO building into something he could stand behind. He asked where they were. He told them to stay at the gate, not to board the plane, Layla said, and he could hear everything she felt in the specific way her voice climbed slightly, that they'd waited all month for this, that they weren't going to let some gate agent ruin it, that they were still going to Boston. Nathan said his daughters' full names, middle names included. Layla Renee Ellis, Imani Grace Ellis. He said them with the tone that he had used perhaps 4 times in their entire lives, the tone that existed below argument and above explanation, the tone of a man who has already made his decision and is giving you the courtesy of being informed rather than the option of being consulted. Do not board that plane, he said. Stay at the gate. Sit down. I'm going to handle this. A silence. Okay, Layla whispered. Okay, Dad. Nathan hung up, set his phone on the desk, and looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stood. He walked to his office door and opened it, and his executive assistant Phyllis looked up from her computer with the expression of someone who has just registered a change in atmospheric pressure and is reassessing the day accordingly. Phyllis had worked for Nathan Ellis for 9 years, through 4 board reshuffles and 2 airline acquisitions, and 1 labor strike that had lasted 11 days and required him to be in 6 cities in 8 days, and she had seen him in every variation of pressure and stress that the CEO of a major airline could produce, and she had always been able to read the situation from his face and respond accordingly. She had never seen what she saw on his face at this moment. I need Raymond Cole on the phone right now, Nathan said, and I need you to cancel the board meeting. Phyllis blinked. Cancel the board. Cancel everything I have today, Phyllis. Every meeting, every call, everything. He paused at the door of his office. Get me Raymond. Raymond Cole was Apex Airways VP of Operations, a 15-year veteran of the company, experienced and competent, and specifically experienced in managing exactly the kind of logistical crisis that Nathan was about to create, which was why Nathan called him first. The call lasted 45 seconds. Nathan said ground, every Apex Airways flight effective immediately, every departure, every gate, every plane on every tarmac under the Apex name. Raymond's silence lasted exactly 5 seconds, and in those 5 seconds, Nathan could practically hear the full scope of catastrophe assembling itself in Raymond's mind. The cost calculations, the passenger impact, the media exposure, the board reaction, the legal implications, every nightmare scenario that a VP of operations stores in the back of his mind for the specific purpose of never actually using. Can I at least ask why Raymond said, 2 17-year-old girls were racially profiled inside our airline this morning? Nathan said, his voice as level as if he were discussing the quarterly fuel contract. They were questioned, humiliated, detained, and searched without cause. They were treated like criminals for being black and having the audacity to fly first class. And it happened in our terminal by our employees under our name. I am not going to sit in a boardroom and review quarterly numbers while that is the reality of what this airline is today. A pause on Raymond's end, shorter than the first one. Marcus. There are other ways to... That's not a request, Raymond. That's an order from the CEO of this company. Every plane on the ground, every departure canceled, every gate closed. Do it now. He ended the call. He stood at the window of his office and looked out at Atlanta spread 40 stories below him, the city where he had started this entire journey at the age of 22 in an orange safety vest that was 2 sizes too big, and he thought about the distance between that tarmac and this window, and he thought about his daughters sitting at gate C-14, and he thought about the journal. His hands were not quite steady. He had just shut down an airline. Every plane in the Apex fleet was about to receive a signal it had never received before, from a source it had never had reason to question. Every departure board in every Apex-served airport in the country was about to change. 52,000 passengers were about to have their days rerouted. He had done it in 45 seconds. He was still standing at the window when Phyllis knocked softly and told him that his communications director, Simone, was already calling, that CNN had reached the media line that the board chair's office was holding, that social media was moving faster than the communications team could track. Not yet, Nathan said without turning from the window. Tell them no comment. Tell the board I'll be in touch. Tell Simone to hold every statement until I contact her directly. And the board meeting, Phyllis asked. Tell them the CEO made a decision. Tell them I stand behind it completely. He picked up his phone and texted his daughters. I'm coming to Atlanta. Stay at the gate. Don't talk to anyone. I love you both. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, put it on, and walked out. At gate C-14, Layla held the phone in both hands and stared at the screen after the call ended the way you stare at something after it delivers information that your mind has accepted but not yet fully processed. Running it back, checking the edges of it, looking for the part that doesn't make sense so you can identify it and dismiss it. Except that in this case, every part of it made sense in a way that was somehow more unsettling than if it hadn't. Imani was writing in her journal again, the pen moving in the steady rhythm of someone reclaiming something. The same journal that Victoria Strand had held open in a checkpoint 40 minutes ago. The same pages, the same words now back in the hands that had written them, and there was something in the act of continuing to write in it that was not defiance exactly, but was in the same family as defiance. The quiet insistence that what happened to it does not change what it is. He said, "Don't board the plane," Layla said. "I know," Imani said. "I heard." He sounded... Layla paused, searching for the word. He sounded like he'd already decided something before he even finished listening to me. Imani looked up. "What do you think he's going to do?" Layla looked at her phone, then at the departure board above them, where their flight was still showing. On time in reassuring green. And she shook her head. "I don't know. But I've heard him use that voice maybe 3 times in my entire life, and every time he used it, something actually happened." The departure board flickered. It was subtle at first, a brief interruption in the display, the kind that usually precedes a routine update, a gate change or a time adjustment, the ordinary recalibrations of a busy airport morning. Layla noticed it and pointed without speaking, and Imani looked up in time to see the status next to Apex, Flight 1147 to Chicago, change from on time to delayed. Then another flight changed. Then another. Then within 30 seconds, every single Apex Airways flight on the board switched from on time to delayed. All of them simultaneously, the green letters replaced by amber across the entire display in a cascade that moved fast enough to be clearly not routine, Clearly not a gate change or a weather adjustment. Clearly something else entirely. The gate area transformed. Passengers who had been in their phones looked up. A man in a gray suit stood and walked briskly to the counter. Voices rose in volume and pitch, the specific sound of a crowd shifting from mild impatience to genuine alarm. A gate agent, who looked no older than 22, began typing frantically at her screen with an expression of someone who has just received information she doesn't have the authority or the knowledge to explain. Layla pulled up Twitter. The hashtag was already there, #ApexGrounded, and it was moving fast, trending nationally within what the platform's indicators suggested was a matter of minutes. Passengers posting videos from terminals in New York and Dallas and Los Angeles planes, sitting motionless at gates that should have been clear departure boards, showing the same amber wave that Layla was watching happen live in front of her. And then, a tweet from an aviation journalist with a blue verification mark, sources inside Apex Airways confirm system-wide grounding, ordered directly from CEO level, reason unknown, developing. Imani read the tweet over Layla's shoulder. She went very still. "Who has the power to do that?" Imani said. And it was not quite a question because they both already knew it wasn't a question because the answer had been assembling itself piece by piece since Layla had put the phone down 2 minutes ago, and now here it was, complete and inescapable and enormous. Layla looked at her sister. The noise of the terminal crashed around them, angry passengers, confused gate agents, the announcement system cutting in and out, and in the middle of all of it, 2 17-year-old girls sat at gate C-14 and arrived simultaneously and without saying it aloud at the truth about their father. The realization didn't come all at once. It assembled itself the way complex truths usually do from pieces that had always been present, but whose arrangement had never before suggested the picture they were now unmistakably forming. Layla started recalling things, the phone calls her father took in his home office with the door closed. Emerging 30 minutes later, looking like he had been somewhere far away and needed a moment to come back. The trips he took that he described only in the vaguest terms. Meetings, operational stuff. You know how it is. The time he came home from Washington looking like he hadn't slept, and Renata had sent the girls upstairs without explanation. The Christmas 2 years ago, when he had given them the first-class tickets and said, "I got a good deal through work," and Layla had thought at the time that the phrase "through work" was doing a lot of unexamined work. Imani was running the same inventory. She could tell they were always running the same inventory, just from slightly different angles, which was part of what made them effective when they needed to think through something together. "The way Mom changes the subject whenever someone asks about his office," Imani said quietly. "The weight of the world comment," Layla said. "The time Grandma Evelyn said on the phone we weren't supposed to hear, but we did. She said your father carries more than most men ever have to carry, and he does it so you don't have to feel it. And don't tell anyone who your dad is." They said the last one at the same time, and it landed between them with the full force of everything it had apparently always meant, and they had apparently always managed to misunderstand. Layla set her phone down on the seat beside her and looked at the departure board, all those amber delayed notices, all those grounded planes, and said very quietly, "Dad is the CEO of Apex Airways." It was not a question. It was not a theory. It was a puzzle piece, settling into a space that had been waiting for it with the patient precision of something that was always going to end up exactly there. "We told people he handled scheduling," Imani said. She had closed her journal without finishing the sentence. She'd been writing something she almost never did. "We literally told people he probably loaded luggage when he started." Deshaun felt sorry for us, Layla. He offered to help me apply for a fee waiver for SAT prep because he thought we might need it. "Good," Layla said, and the word came out with a layer of something that was almost a laugh. Then she stopped. "Wait, he always said good when we told him things like that. Every time we mentioned that someone thought we were just regular, every time we said a friend had no idea what he did, he always said good. like it was the point. Nathan's text arrived on Layla's phone. "I'm coming to Atlanta. Stay at the gate. Don't talk to anyone. I love you both." She read it 3 times. Imani read it over her shoulder once and then sat back and was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was thinking through something that required space. 3 gates down the concourse, Derek Holloway was behind the check-in counter, fielding a rapidly growing line of frustrated passengers demanding to know why their flights had been canceled, and he was managing it with the thin-stretched professionalism of a man who has been in customer service long enough to handle almost anything when his direct supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald, appeared at his elbow and leaned in close enough to speak without being heard over the noise. Derek Gerald said, "The CEO is coming here. Personally. To this terminal. And he asked for your name specifically." Derek processed this in approximately 1 second, then laughed the reflexive laugh of someone who has just heard something they've categorized as impossible without quite thinking about why they've done so. For what? A grounding. He'll send a memo. Gerald did not laugh. Gerald's expression, in fact, did not change at all. "Derek," he said again. "He asked for your name specifically." Derek Holloway looked at his supervisor's face, and the laugh stopped. The color drained from his in a way that was visible from several feet away, a sudden complete withdrawal as though his face had made a decision about circulation without consulting him. And his mouth opened and then closed again, and he gripped the edge of the counter, and for the first time in his 11 years with Apex Airways, Derek Holloway understood with the full physical weight of the knowledge what it felt like to have no power at all. Nathan's company car pulled directly onto the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson, cleared through the private access gate with the kind of speed that happens when the call comes from the CEO's office directly, and he was met at the executive terminal entrance by the regional director of Apex's Atlanta operations, a man named Gerald Osei, who was sweating through his collar despite the terminal's aggressive air conditioning, and whose entire bearing communicated the specific terror of a middle manager who has realized that the problem he thought was somewhere else is directly beneath his feet. "Mr. Ellis, sir. I want you to know that we've already begun a preliminary review of this morning's incidents, and I've personally contacted both the check-in supervisor and the 'Where are my daughters?' Nathan said." Gerald stopped mid-sentence with the specific abruptness of a man whose train of thought has been physically removed from its track. "Gate C14, Nathan said. 2 17-year-old girls, Layla and Imani Ellis. Where are they?" Gerald blinked, rapid, uncertain, and then something crossed his face that was the visible processing of a connection being made. "Jackson Ellis, sir. Are they related to?" Nathan did not answer. He did not need to. His expression answered for him, and the answer made Gerald Osei take one physical step backward. "They're still at the gate," Gerald said quickly. "I stationed 2 senior staff nearby to make sure they were comfortable. They don't know why." "Take me to them now." They moved through the private corridor that connected the executive terminal to the main concourse, a hallway most passengers never know exists, built behind the walls of the public space, unremarkable and purposeful, and Nathan's footsteps echoed against the floor with a rhythm that felt to him like a countdown, each step closing the distance between where he was and where his daughters were, and the distance felt both too long and not long enough because on the other side of it, he was going to have to tell them something that he had been keeping from them for 17 years. He walked through the doors of Concourse C. The terminal was in full chaos. Every Apex gate closed, every screen showing "canceled" in red letters. Passengers sitting on floors with their carry-ons clutched against them. Passengers standing in clusters talking loudly into phones. Passengers at the counters with the specific body language of people who have run out of patience and are now running on something rawer, and less managed gate agents doing their professional best against questions they had no answers to give. Nathan heard none of it. His eyes found Gate C14, and his daughters and everything else went silent in the specific way that the world goes silent when you see the people you love most after something has happened to them. The ambient noise of the universe simply stops mattering. Layla saw him first. She was sitting with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, the posture Renata had taught both of them to maintain in public spaces, composed and dignified and visibly unbothered, regardless of what was actually happening inside a posture that was itself a kind of armor that black girls learn to wear early and never fully take off. She was maintaining that posture now in the middle of a chaotic terminal surrounded by hundreds of stranded strangers after a morning that would have entitled her to abandon it completely. The moment she saw her father crossing the concourse toward her, something in her face broke open. Not in pieces, it didn't fall apart. It opened the way a door opens, releasing something that had been contained and was now free. And what came through was the specific expression of a teenager who has been holding herself together by sheer force of will for several hours and has just seen the one person whose presence makes it possible to stop. Nathan Ellis covered the distance in 6 strides. He pulled both girls into his arms at exactly the same time, one arm around Layla, one around Imani, and held them with the full physical conviction of a man who has wanted to do this for 3 hours and is not going to do it halfway. He held them for 30 full seconds. A man who had just halted a $4.8 billion airline with a single phone call standing in the middle of a public terminal in front of hundreds of witnesses holding his daughters like they were 5 years old, and he had just found them after losing them in a crowd. Imani made a small sound against his chest. Not a sob, something smaller and more private than that. The sound of someone exhaling something they have been carrying all morning. "I'm here," Nathan said, and his voice was low and completely steady. The voice he used when steadiness was a gift rather than an affect. "I'm right here." When they finally separated, Layla's eyes were wet, but her voice was even. She asked him what was happening, whether any of this was real, whether every flight being canceled was actually because of them. Nathan sat across from them, elbows on knees, hands clasped, and he looked at his daughters. Really looked at them, the way you look at people when you are about to say something you have been deciding whether to say for 17 years, and the time for deciding has conclusively passed. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago," he said. And then he told them, not just that he was the CEO, though he told them that clearly and without softening it, but the whole thing. The 24 years, the ramp agent job, the calluses, the MBA on the cafeteria table, the promotions, the rooms full of people who had decided before he opened his mouth that he didn't belong there. The decision to keep it from them, and why he made it what he thought he was giving them by keeping it. He told them that the "don't tell anyone who your dad is" had never been a joke. The silence that followed this was the kind of silence that happens when a large piece of reality shifts, and everything that was sitting on top of it needs a moment to settle into its new position. Layla said, "You're the CEO." Not a question. The sound of a final piece clicking into place so completely that the click was almost audible. Imani said quietly, "We told Deshawn you probably handled scheduling." Nathan looked at her. "He felt sorry for us," Imani said. "He offered to help me apply for an SAT fee waiver." The corner of Nathan's mouth moved. "Good," he said, and both girls recognized the word instantly. And the recognition hit them with the force of something that had always been there, and is only now fully visible, and they both had to look away for a moment, each of them privately and separately, arriving at the same understanding of all the things their father had been all along beneath the version of him they had been permitted to know. "Come with me," Nathan said, and stood. It was not a question and not a command exactly. It was the invitation of a man who has decided that the people he is protecting deserve to be present for their own protection, that standing behind someone while they fight for you is a different and lesser thing than standing beside them. Layla and Amani stood. They followed their father through the terminal toward the Apex check-in counter. Derek Holloway was still behind the desk when they arrived, working through the line of stranded passengers with the mechanical professionalism of a man who has run out of useful things to feel and is now simply executing tasks, head down, eyes on his screen. The particular posture of someone trying to be invisible through productivity. Nathan stopped 10 feet away. He stood and watched Derek for a moment, not threateningly, not dramatically, just with the stillness of a man who is making sure he has seen exactly what he came to see. Layla and Amani stood on either side of him. They did not speak. They watched. Derek looked up with the automatic customer service expression, the surface smile that activated on contact, and began his practiced apology about the flight delays, the operational issue, the inconvenience, the rescheduling options available at the "My name is Nathan Ellis," Nathan said. 3 words. Flat, clear, the information delivered without inflection, the way you state something that is simply true. Derek's mouth stopped moving. The name went through him visibly. Nathan could see it happening the way a name processes through a mind that contains contextual information about it. The associations assembling themselves rapidly, and then the moment when the assembly completed and the full picture came into focus, and the blood left Derek Holloway's face so completely and so fast that the man beside him at the adjacent counter took one look at him and asked if he needed water. "You're," Derek started, "CEO of Apex Airways," Nathan said. "And this morning 2 young women came to this counter with valid first-class boarding passes. They were 17 years old. They were black, and you treated them like they had stolen something." Derek's hands found the edge of the counter. His eyes moved to Layla and Amani, and this was the moment the Keechban had been moving toward since Derek Holloway looked up from his screen that morning and made a series of decisions about who deserved to stand where. Derek looked at the girls, really looked at them, and Layla looked back at him with an expression that was not angry and not triumphant, and was in some ways more devastating than either of those things would have been, because it was simply patient, the expression of someone who already knew exactly who he was, and had known it since the first moment he'd looked at them. "I was following standard procedure for all," Derek began. "There is no such procedure," Nathan said. "I wrote the procedures for this airline. Every single one. And there is no procedure, no policy, no protocol that instructs gate agents to question the legitimacy of paying passengers based on what they look like or what they're wearing or how old they are. What you did this morning was not procedure. That was you. That was a choice you made the moment you looked at these 2 and decided they couldn't possibly belong in first class." Derek's voice had gone very small. "Mr. Ellis, I've been with this company for 11 years. I have a family." "You have children," Nathan said. "Yes, sir. 2. 9 and 7. "How old is the 9-year-old? She's a girl, sir. If your 9-year-old walked up to a counter with a valid boarding pass and the person behind that counter looked at her and decided she didn't deserve the seat she'd been assigned, and made her stand to the side for 20 minutes while every other child in the line went through without a question, what would you do?" Derek did not answer. The question had a quality that made answering it impossible, because every honest answer led directly back to the thing Nathan was holding him accountable for, and Derek Holloway knew it, and the knowing of it was visible on his face. "I'll tell you what you'd do," Nathan said. "You'd burn the place down. And that's exactly what I'm doing." He turned to Gerald, who had been standing 2 feet away through the entire exchange. "I want Derek Holloway suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Badge revoked, system access terminated, and I want him escorted out of this terminal in the next 5 minutes." "Yes, sir," Gerald said. Derek's knees buckled a slight involuntary drop that he caught by tightening his grip on the counter, and he began to say something, another appeal, another invocation of his years and his family and his record. But Nathan had already turned away, and the turning away was its own kind of statement. the statement of a man who has said what he came to say and does not need to hear the response. As they walked back toward Gate C-14, Layla fell into step beside her father, and after a moment she said, "He looked at us when you said it, when you told him who we were. He looked at us like he was finally seeing us." "Yes," Nathan said. "Was that the point? Bringing us there?" Nathan considered this honestly the way he tried to consider everything his daughters asked him. "Part of it," he said. "You were there this morning. You should be there now. This is yours as much as mine." Imani on his other side said quietly, "He looked scared." "He should be," Layla said. "I know," Imani said, but also he looked surprised, like he genuinely didn't understand until that moment that we were real people, like the whole morning we were just a problem he was solving, and then we were suddenly people. She paused. "That's almost worse than the fear." Nathan looked at his daughter, this 17-year-old who wrote every day in a journal she carried everywhere, who observed the world with the careful attention of someone who understood that observation was its own form of power, and he thought that Imani Grace Ellis had in 20 seconds articulated something that most people with decades more experience never quite managed to put into words. "Write that down," he said. Imani looked up at him. "I was going to." Later that day, when Nathan sat across from his daughters and asked them to tell him everything, every detail, every moment, every word Layla told him about something that had happened between the phone call and his arrival. Something she hadn't mentioned on the call, because it was still happening when she was on the phone, and something that she had not fully processed until she was sitting across from her father with his full and undivided attention. After Imani had said, "Call him," and Layla had called, and Nathan had told them to stay at the gate, and after they had watched the departure board flip to amber across the board, and after the first wave of passenger chaos had begun, and they were sitting at Gate C-14 watching it unfold, a man in a uniform that identified him as an Apex ground supervisor had approached them with a clipboard and a manner that was professionally courteous, in the specific way that professional courtesy can be a tool of pressure rather than comfort. He had told them they needed to come with him for a brief verification process related to this morning's check-in irregularity. Layla had asked what that meant. He had said it was standard follow-up, nothing to worry about, just a few questions, very routine. Layla had said she would wait for her father. The supervisor had said that the process would go faster if they cooperated now, and that if there were concerns about the legitimacy of their travel documentation, it would be better for everyone to resolve them quietly and quickly before things escalated further. The word legitimacy. The word escalated. Layla had heard the architecture of both of those words in that sentence, the suggestion that their documentation was legitimately in question, the suggestion that they were the ones who might cause escalation. And she had looked at Imani, and Imani had looked at her, and Imani had said, barely audible, "Not here, not like this," and Layla had understood, and said out loud, in a voice that was composed, with an effort she was not going to acknowledge, "We'll come with you." They were put in separate small rooms off the concourse, not large enough to be called offices, not small enough to be called closets, the kind of spaces that exist in airports for exactly this purpose, for exactly this kind of conversation, and questioned individually for 11 minutes each about the nature of their travel, who had purchased the tickets, the purpose of their trip, whether they had contacts waiting for them in Chicago or Boston, whether they were traveling at anyone's direction. Imani had answered every question in a clear and measured voice. She had explained the college tour, the names of the institutions, the dates. She had explained that her father had purchased the tickets. She had not said which father or what he did, because she didn't know yet exactly what he did, though the knowledge was forming, and also because she understood instinctively, with the specific instinct of a girl who has spent 17 years learning to read rooms before entering them, that providing more information than was asked for was rarely the safer choice. She had answered every question and shown nothing of what she was actually feeling, which was something she would write about later in her journal with the precision it deserved the experience of being required to prove your innocence when you have committed no offense in a small room alone, while your sister is in another small room, also proving her innocence, the two of you separated by bureaucratic procedure from the single most destabilizing day of your lives thus far. Nathan's second text had arrived on Layla's phone at the 11-minute mark. I'm in the building. Nobody moves. The supervisor's phone rang 30 seconds later. He listened for 4 seconds. He said yes, sir, twice, and then understood once. He ended the call, returned Layla's belongings, which he had been holding on the clipboard in a way she had registered without commenting on, and left the room without looking directly at her. When Nathan heard this part of the account, sitting at a table in the terminal with his daughters across from him, their voices steady, his jaw tightening with each sentence, he did not interrupt. He let Imani finish the story in her own precise and careful words, and then he was quiet for a moment. I was so careful, Imani said. The whole time. I answered everything and showed nothing because I knew that the moment I showed fear or anger, they would use it to confirm whatever they had already decided. Nathan looked at his daughter. I know, he said, and I'm sorry you knew that. I'm sorry that's the thing you had to know. The media had descended on Hartsfield-Jackson with the speed that major stories generate when they combine breaking news with viral social content. 19 cameras, 40-plus microphones, reporters from networks that had received the tip about the grounding within minutes of Raymond Cole's first phone call to the operations team and had been mobilizing ever since. Simone Jeffries Nathan's communications director had a prepared statement. She had drafted it in 40 minutes, revised it twice, and it was careful and measured and corporate, and it attributed the grounding to an operational review triggered by a serious passenger experience concern, and it promised a full internal investigation, and it mentioned the airline's commitment to inclusive service, and it said nothing that could be directly quoted by a plaintiff's attorney. Nathan took the statement, read it to the second sentence, and handed it back. Throw it away, he said. Simone looked at him. Nathan. The legal team, specifically. Throw it away, Simone. I'm not reading a corporate statement written by lawyers. I'm going to stand in front of those cameras and tell the truth. The board is going to. The board can do whatever they need to do afterward. Right now, I'm going to talk. He walked to the makeshift press position that the airport communications team had assembled near the main Apex check-in area, and Layla and Imani fell into step behind him without being asked, which was the thing he would remember most about that moment later, that they simply came without hesitation, without being directed, shouldering in beside each other, and then behind him, chins, level eyes forward, the specific bearing of young women who have decided that what happens next matters enough to witness in person. Nathan gripped the edges of the podium that someone had rolled in from somewhere, looked directly into the nearest camera lens, and said the words that would be replayed on every major broadcast in the country for the next 72 hours. My name is Nathan Ellis, and today I grounded every plane in my airline because the mistreatment of black passengers in this industry ends right here, right now with me. The camera flashes were immediate and continuous. He did not flinch. He let them all land. Then he told the whole story without notes, without the careful language of corporate insulation, in the plain and direct way that you tell a story when it belongs to you, and you have decided that the belonging matters more than the management. He told them his daughters' names and their ages and their GPAs and what they were flying to Boston to do the college tour, the schools they were visiting, the future they had been building toward with the particular combination of effort and joy that happens when a young person is genuinely in love with what they're working toward. He said it had been supposed to be one of the best days of their lives. He paused there, not for effect, but because his throat did something involuntary that required a moment to move through, and he moved through it. He told them about Derek Holloway, every fact specific and clear, without editorial. The additional ID request, the 20 minutes the white couple processed in 90 seconds the way Derek had held their IDs up to the light. He told them about Victoria Strand, about the blue gloves, about the journal. Then he looked directly into the center camera and said the thing that the press conference had been building toward, the thing that had been true for his entire career, and that he was saying for the first time all the way, if my daughters, the daughters of the CEO of this airline, can be treated this way inside our own terminals, then I want every person in this country to ask themselves one question. What is happening every single day to the black passengers who walk through our doors without a father who can pick up a phone and stop everything? What is happening to them? I'll tell you what's happening. The same thing. Every day. And it stops today. For 9 minutes, the cameras did not stop flashing. Behind him, Layla stood very still and watched her father do something she had never seen anyone do in any context she had ever been part of. Not in a school assembly, not in a movie, not in any story she had ever been told. She watched a person who had the power to manage this situation. Choose not to manage it. Choose instead to make it real, to refuse the comfortable armor of corporate language and stand in front of the whole world with nothing between them and the truth. She felt something shift inside her. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the deep and permanent quality of a shift that is going to be part of you from now on, that you are going to carry forward into everything you do next. Imani reached over and took her hand. She held it through the rest of the press conference, the two of them standing shoulder to shoulder behind their father while the cameras flashed and flashed and flashed. Lawrence Whitfield had been the board chair of Apex Airways for 14 years, and in that time he had developed a particular relationship with crisis. He treated it the way certain people treat difficult weather, as something to be managed and moved through with minimum exposure and maximum efficiency. And he had been good at this for so long that he had come to think of it as a form of leadership rather than a form of avoidance. He found Nathan near the press position after the cameras had finally been satisfied, and his face communicated the specific tension of a man who has watched something happen that cannot be unwatched and is now trying to calculate what that means for the next 14 things that need to happen. "We need to speak privately," Lawrence said. "In a closed room right now." "I just told the truth in front of 200 reporters," Nathan said. "I'm not hiding in a closed room." Lawrence's jaw tightened. "Then I'll say it here. The stock is down 8%. 4 major corporate accounts have called threatening to pull their contracts. The pilots' union is demanding a formal briefing. There are 52,000 passengers stranded across the country because of a decision you made unilaterally, Nathan. Without consulting the board, without consulting legal, without consulting anyone." "I'm aware of the decision I made," Nathan said. "What do you want me to tell the board?" "Tell them I made a decision and I stand behind it. Tell them I'll have a reform plan within 30 days. And tell them this: if a single member of that board would like to look me in the eye and tell me they would have done differently, if it had been their children sitting in that terminal, I will listen very carefully to what they have to say." Lawrence held Nathan's gaze for a moment. Then he said with something that was not quite warmth, but was in the direction of it, "The board convenes in 2 hours. I'd recommend being reachable." The call lasted 97 minutes. Nathan was not invited, and he did not need to be. What he didn't know until much later was what happened at the 54th minute, when Dr. Adesi Okafor, a Lagos-born civil rights attorney who had joined the Apex board 3 years earlier and who was the only other person of color among the 11 members, interrupted a discussion about financial containment strategies with a question delivered in the calm, precise voice of someone who has been waiting a specific amount of time before speaking and has decided that amount of time has passed. "I want to ask everyone in this room a single question," Adeyeze said. "If Nathan's daughters had been white girls, and a gate agent had treated them the way they were treated today, would we be having this conversation? Would we be questioning Nathan's judgment? Or would we be praising him for protecting his family?" The room did not answer. "That's what I thought," Adeyeze said. "The stock will recover. stocks recover. But if we remove a black CEO for defending his black daughters from discrimination carried out by employees of his own airline, the damage to this company will not be in the next quarter's numbers. It will be in what this company decides it is. And I think we should be very clear with ourselves about what that decision means before we make it. Lawrence called Nathan at 8:17 that evening. The board's vote was unanimous in support of his position, and they were requesting a comprehensive reform plan within 30 days. Nathan asked who had changed the temperature in the room. Lawrence said Adeze Okafor. Nathan said he would call her personally in the morning. He stood at the gate window for a moment after the call ended, the Atlanta night visible through the glass, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, and not triumph, but the specific, unfamiliar lightness of a man who has made an irrevocable decision and is now, for the first time, fully sure it was the right one. Darius Webb. Apex's general counsel had been busy since the moment Nathan called him from the car, and the results of that work arrived in a series of updates across the afternoon and evening that Nathan received and absorbed with the same focused attention he applied to everything that mattered. The security footage from the TSA checkpoint had been preserved and archived within the hour. Darius had watched it personally before filing the complaint, and his assessment, delivered with the careful precision of a man who does not use words like unambiguous lightly, was that the footage was unambiguous. Victoria Strand had selected Imani Ellis for additional screening, without mechanical cause had extended that screening to Layla Ellis, without any stated rationale had opened and read a private journal without legal basis, and had conducted the entire process in a manner that would not withstand review under the TSA's own guidelines for secondary screening procedures. She was placed on administrative leave within 4 hours of the formal complaint being filed. What Darius discovered during the subsequent records review was the part that landed differently, the part that transformed a single incident involving one officer into something that required a fundamentally different response. Victoria Strand had 31 prior written passenger complaints in her file spanning 19 months. Every single one of them had been filed by a passenger of color. Every single one of them had been marked as reviewed and resolved in the database without documentation of a single investigative action taken, without a single follow-up communication sent to the passenger who had filed it, without a single note from a supervisor indicating any concern had been registered. 31 times, a passenger had taken the time and the effort to put their experience in writing and submit it through official channels. 31 times that experience had been received, logged, categorized, and filed in a database that was apparently designed to store complaints rather than act on them. The federal investigation that followed Victoria Strand's case was not swift, because federal investigations rarely are, but it was real and it was documented, and when its findings were published 3 months later, they confirmed every element of Darius's initial assessment and added new findings about the secondary screening practices at the 5 busiest checkpoints in Hartsfield-Jackson, findings that triggered a national TSA review that was the most extensive examination of secondary screening practices the agency had conducted in over a decade. Victoria Strand was removed from her position. When Nathan told his daughters this, he also told them about the 31 prior complaints. Imani wrote down the number without saying anything. Then she looked at her father and said, 31 people before us went through something like what happened to me and nobody did anything. Yes, Nathan said. We have to be sure Imani said that the 32nd person doesn't have to. The board meeting the following morning had been moved from Charlotte to a conference room at the Atlanta Marriott, and all 11 members were present, 6 in person, 5 on screen, when Nathan walked in with his 14-page reform plan and did not sit down. He stood at the end of the table and looked at the people who had voted unanimously the night before to support a decision that had cost over $60 million in a single afternoon, and he recognized something in the room that he had not expected, not just institutional anxiety, but something more personal. In several faces, the expression of people who have been asked to look at something they have not looked at before and are still in the early stages of what that requires. Before I go through the plan, Nathan said I need to give you a number. He let the silence build for exactly 1 second. 3,847. He wrote it on the whiteboard behind him. That is the number of unresolved discrimination complaints filed by Apex Airways passengers over the past 5 years. 3,847 people who took the time to write down what happened to them, to put it in a form and submit it through our official channels, because they believed they had to believe that someone at this airline would read it and do something about it. He paused. Of those 3,847 complaints, how many do you think were actually investigated, followed up on, and resolved with any form of direct response to the passenger who filed them? The room was quiet. 79, Nathan said. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of intelligent people are confronted with a number that makes a previously comfortable position impossible to maintain. Several of the board members looked at the table. One of them, Walter Briggs, a 64-year-old finance veteran who had been with the board for 8 years, said quietly, "I had no idea." "None of us did," Nathan said. "And that is the point. We built a structure, layered, bureaucratic, professionally insulated, that was designed to receive complaints without requiring anyone in this room to see them. We built a system that absorbed the evidence of its own failures and stored it where nobody who had the power to act on it would ever have to look at it. I sat in this chair for 5 years and never once asked to see the discrimination complaint data. That is on me. That ends today." The 3-part reform plan that followed had been drafted between 4 in the morning and 6:15, and it showed the quality of thought that happens when a person is not managing a situation but addressing it. The first element, a mandatory 60-hour anti-discrimination certification for every Apex frontline employee, gate agents, flight attendants, ground crew, customer service staff, to be completed within 90 days, or their employment would be reviewed. The second, an independent oversight committee composed of 3 external civil rights organizations, not company-affiliated, not company-controlled, publishing quarterly public reports on discrimination incidents at Apex, fully transparent, available to anyone with an internet connection. The third, a personal individual apology to all 3,847 passengers who had filed unresolved discrimination complaints. Not a form letter, not a travel voucher, not a digital acknowledgement generated by a software program, but a letter written and signed by a senior Apex executive, followed by a direct phone call. "How long will the apology process take?" Lawrence asked. 14 months, Nathan said, "at minimum. And you're committed to doing every one of them." "We are committed to doing every one of them," Nathan said. "Because every one of them is a person. They're not data points. They're not entries in a complaint database. They're people who tried to tell us something was wrong and we put them in a drawer. The least we can do is open the drawer." The board approved all 3 elements, unanimously. Not comfortably, several of the faces on the screen showed the expression of people who have signed on to something significant and are only beginning to understand the full scope of what that means, but completely without dissent. That evening, as the operational team worked through the process of resuming flights and rebooking passengers and managing the cascading logistical consequences of an afternoon-long grounding, Nathan sat in a section of the terminal near Gate C-14 with his daughters, and people came to them. Not airport staff passengers. Stranded travelers who had been sitting with their own canceled flights for hours, who had seen the press conference on their phones or on the monitors that had been running footage on a loop, who had something they needed to say and had decided that the moment to say it was now, while the man who had made it possible was still in the same building. A black woman in her late 50s, dressed for a business trip, came first. She walked up with the deliberate pace of someone who has made a decision and is not going to reverse it. And she stood in front of Nathan and said that 20 years ago, She had been pulled off a plane in Memphis while wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase that she had been seated in coach in a window seat. She had purchased herself with her own money. That a flight attendant had told her a passenger had raised a security concern that she had been escorted off the aircraft in front of 200 people who watched and said nothing. Not one of them, and that it had taken her 4 years before she stopped flinching every time she walked through an airport. And she wanted Nathan to know that what he had done today was the thing she had spent 20 years believing nobody with the power to do it would ever actually do. Nathan shook her hand and held it for a moment, and he said her name when she gave it deliberately as though he was going to remember it, and he was. A white man in his early 60s came next, holding the boarding pass for his canceled flight to Portland. He said he had been furious when the grounding was announced and had been at the counter arguing for 20 minutes, and then he had seen the press conference on the monitor above the counter and had gone quiet and had called his son, who he was supposed to visit, and told him he'd be a day late, but he'd be bringing a story about what it looks like when a person with power uses it the right way. A young black man, 21 or 22, in a law school sweatshirt came last. He stood in front of Nathan and didn't speak immediately, just looked at him with the expression of someone trying to find the right entry point into something he has been carrying and wants to set down carefully. His father, he said, had worked for 28 years as a custodian at an airport in Charlotte, cleaned bathrooms, polished floors, came home every night smelling like industrial cleaner and never once complained. Just told his son every night, "Be better than this place. Go further. Don't stop." He had died 2 years ago before his son started law school, before he got to see what the not stopping had produced. Mr. Ellis, the young man, said my father would have stood up and applauded. Nathan took his hand and shook it and held it, and he didn't trust himself to speak, and so he nodded instead, and the young man nodded back, and they stood like that for a long moment in the middle of a terminal full of strangers. When Renata called that evening, her voice had a quality that Nathan had heard only a handful of times in 22 years of marriage, the quality of a woman who has been watching her husband fight battles she knew about and he never discussed, and has just watched him win one in front of the entire country. "I've watched you come home exhausted from things you never told me the full story of," she said. "I've watched you smile at people who didn't deserve it and hold your tongue in rooms where you had every right to speak. And today I watched you stand in the middle of an airport and say enough. Nathan, I have never been more proud of you. Not once." He pressed the phone against his ear and let her words fill the space in his chest that had been hollow since 4:30 that morning. "The girls are okay," he said. "They're stronger than I understood." "They're Ellis girls," Renata said. "Of course they are." Nathan carried Layla through the terminal on his back for the last 100 meters to the car, because she had fallen so deeply and suddenly asleep in the gate chair that shaking her shoulder had produced only a murmured protest and a readjustment of her position rather than anything resembling consciousness. And Nathan had decided with the executive efficiency he applied to everything that carrying her was faster than waiting. Imani walked beside him, carrying all 3 bags without being asked, because that was who Imani was, the one who quietly picked up what needed to be carried so that other people didn't have to. The hotel suite near the airport was clean and quiet and blessedly anonymous, and Nathan laid Layla on one of the beds, and she curled immediately onto her side without waking, throwing one arm over her face the way she had done since she was 3 years old, a habit so entrenched that he recognized it even in the dark. Imani went to the bathroom, brushed her teeth, came out in pajamas with her journal in her hand. The journal, the one that had traveled through the entire day with her, that had been written in and violated and reclaimed and written in again. And she sat on the edge of the other bed and looked at her father. Nathan was in the chair between the 2 beds, his jacket off his tie, loosened his elbows on his knees, looking at the carpet with the expression of a man who has spent everything he had and is taking inventory of what's left. Dad, Imani said, "Yeah, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts in the way she organized everything, not seeking them out, but giving them the space to present themselves in the right order. The 24 years, she said. All of it. The building, the climbing, the rooms where you were the only one who looked like you. The meetings where people had decided before you opened your mouth you carried all of that alone. You came home and you were our dad and you cooked dinner on Sundays and you helped us with applications and you drove us to track meets and you were completely our dad the whole time. And underneath that, you were carrying all of this enormous other thing, and you never let us see it. Nathan looked at his daughter. Why, she asked. Not the career part, I understand the career part now, but the loneliness of it. The weight of being the first, of being the only, of fighting the same fights over and over in different rooms with different people. Why did you carry that alone? He was quiet for long enough that the question had settled fully into the room before he answered it. Because I thought protecting you meant keeping the weight away from you, he said. I thought if I carried it and you couldn't see it, you'd grow up lighter, more free, like you could move through the world without the specific gravity of knowing how hard it really is. Imani held the journal in her lap. But Dad, we were already carrying it. We've been carrying it every time someone looked at us the way Derek Holloway looked at us this morning. We've been carrying it every time we've had to calculate how to respond to something so that we don't become the problem. We just didn't have the name for it. And I think she paused, looking for the right words with the care she always brought to the ones that mattered most. I think one of the loneliest things is carrying something that you can see clearly and that the person next to you is also carrying, and you're both pretending you can't feel the weight. Nathan's vision blurred. He blinked hard, pressed his thumb and forefinger to the bridge of his nose, held it there for a moment. You don't have to carry it alone anymore, Imani said. She set the journal down on the bed and reached across the space between them and took her father's hand. You have us. We know now, and we're not going anywhere. Nathan Ellis, who had held himself together through a press conference that 58 million people would eventually watch, who had faced a board of directors without flinching, who had sat across from Derek Holloway and delivered exactly the words that situation required without raising his voice, once sat in the chair between his daughter's beds and wept. He did not try to stop it. He wept the way you weep when you have been strong for so long that the strength has become indistinguishable from the person, and then someone who loves you finds the seam of it and holds it open gently enough that the thing underneath can breathe. And what comes through is not weakness, but the specific and necessary release of someone who has finally been seen all the way down. Imani held his hand and did not speak, because she understood that this was not a moment for words, and because that understanding the patience of it, the precision of it, was the thing she had always been best at. And perhaps Nathan thought through the blur and the release of it. Perhaps it was not an accident that out of all the places he could have started, he had started here in a room with his daughters, with the person who has always seen most clearly holding his hand in the dark. Layla slept through it all undisturbed, her arm thrown over her face, her breathing slow and even, one hand curled loosely beside her face the way it had been since before she could talk. Nathan sat between them until they were both asleep, and then he opened his laptop in the quiet and began to write. Not a memo, not a press statement, not talking points vetted by 3 different departments, but a plan 14 pages drafted in the gutted clarity of 4 in the morning by a man who has stopped managing the situation and started actually fixing it. And by the time the Atlanta sky began to lighten, he had something he believed in completely. 3 weeks after the grounding, Nathan gave one interview. He had been offered 47. He chose Margaret Osei, a veteran journalist who had spent 31 years covering civil rights and corporate accountability with a specific combination of rigor and humanity that made her both the most trusted and the most uncomfortable interviewer in her field, because she had a particular gift for creating the conditions in which people told the truth about things they had not planned to discuss. 58 million people watched the interview air on a Sunday evening, which made it the most watched news program of the year to that point. Margaret asked him the question that everyone had been asking for 3 weeks, the question that had appeared in op-eds and social media debates and board discussions and dinner conversations across the country. The question that had been framed as a test of proportionality and reasonable executive judgment and the appropriate scope of personal versus professional responsibility. "Do you think you went too far?" Nathan let 3 full seconds pass before he answered. And those 3 seconds were for many of the 58 million people watching the most important part of the interview, because the length of them communicated that he had heard the question and was taking it seriously rather than dismissing it. Then he said, "Nobody asked me if I went too far when I worked double shifts loading cargo for minimum wage in Atlanta heat that would have hospitalized most people. Nobody asked if things had gone too far when I was passed over for promotion 3 separate times, because my supervisors at the time did not believe that a black man was capable of leading a team, despite a record that was better than anyone who was promoted ahead of me. Nobody asked if it was too much when my daughters stood in a checkpoint and had their private journal read by a stranger as though their thoughts were evidence of something criminal. The world only ever asks if someone has gone too far when a black man finally stops accepting what everyone else has decided to tolerate. And I am tired, genuinely deeply done with being tired of that question." 58 million people heard that answer. What happened afterward was not a single dramatic shift, but 100 smaller ones. A school board in Ohio adding a unit on discrimination in public spaces to its curriculum because a teacher who watched the interview decided it was time. A major hotel chain announcing a review of its front desk training protocols the following week. A congressional subcommittee requesting testimony from Nathan and 2 other airline executives on discrimination practices in the travel industry. A magazine running a cover story on the 3,847 with the faces and names of 40 passengers who agreed to share their experiences, which was the story that most directly changed the public conversation from "did he go too far" to "how far back does this go?" Not everything changed at once. But something shifted the way things shift when a person with power uses it to do the thing that needed doing rather than the thing that was most convenient. And the shift was real, and it was documented, and it was for the people it most directly affected experienced as something that resembled hope. 4 months after the grounding, the changes at Apex Airways were measurable and public because Nathan had insisted from the beginning that public accountability meant public reporting, and that honesty about difficult numbers was more durable than clean numbers that hid difficult realities. Every Apex frontline employee had completed the 60-hour anti-discrimination certification. The process had been difficult, not just logistically but emotionally, because the program had been designed by one of the country's leading civil rights organizations, and it did not approach the subject as a compliance exercise, but as an honest examination of bias authority and the gap between stated values and lived practice. 17 employees resigned rather than completed. Most of them were frontline staff who had multiple prior discrimination complaints in their files. One was a mid-level manager. One was a regional supervisor with 19 years at the company who, upon listening to Nathan's company-wide address about the certification requirements, packed his desk quietly, wrote a single-sentence resignation letter. "I cannot work for a company that treats feelings as equivalent to facts," and walked out without saying goodbye to anyone. Nathan read the letter, set it down, and said to Simone Good, "If he thinks human dignity is a feeling, he was never building what we're building." The Independent Oversight Committee published its first quarterly report. The numbers in it were, as Nathan had predicted to the board, ugly, a detailed accounting of discrimination-adjacent incidents, complaint patterns, and demographic disparities in secondary screening rates at Apex-operated facilities that made the board uncomfortable, and made the public angry, and made the 3,847 people whose complaints had been sitting in a database feel, many of them for the first time, that someone had actually read what they wrote. The stock had dropped 11% in the week following the grounding. By the 4-month mark, it had not only recovered but exceeded its previous high by 7%, driven partly by new customer acquisition from passengers who had actively chosen Apex because of the reforms, a group that the marketing team's research identified as the fastest-growing segment of new bookings in the company's history. Victoria Strand's Federal Review concluded. Its findings confirmed everything that Darius Webb's initial assessment had indicated, plus additional evidence regarding the secondary screening practices at the checkpoint where Layla and Imani had been stopped. She was removed from her position. The TSA announced a national review of its additional screening guidelines, the most comprehensive examination of those practices in over a decade. And the apology process continued one letter and one phone call at a time, a senior Apex executive sitting down daily with the list of 3,847 names and working through it with the unhurried seriousness of people who understand that they are not completing a task but making amends, and that making amends cannot be done on a deadline without losing the thing that makes it matter. 6 months after the morning that had rearranged everything, Layla and Imani Ellis returned to Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Same terminal, same concourse, same gate C-14. They walked in through the same revolving doors, pulling the same carry-on bags, first-class boarding passes on their phones, seats 2A and 2B, their names clear on the screen, the flight to Boston that they had never gotten to take. The terminal felt different in a way that was difficult to name precisely because terminals don't change. Not really, the floors are the same. Polished concrete. The departure boards run the same amber and green. The noise level follows the same pattern of compression and release. And yet, it felt different, the way a place feels different when you have become someone different inside it, when the distance between who you were the first time and who you are now is large enough to change the quality of the light. At the check-in counter, a young woman looked up when they approached, and her face did something genuine. A smile that was not the automatic activation of a customer service default, but an actual expression of actual recognition present in the eyes and not just the mouth. "Hi, can I help you check in?" "We're set," Layla said, holding up her phone with the boarding pass. "Just checking in for Flight 1147. The agent glanced at the screen and then back at the girls, and her smile widened. "Oh, you're the Ellis sisters." Layla and Imani exchanged a glance. "Everyone at this airline knows who you are," the agent said. She said it simply, without performance, as though it were just a fact. "What happened to you, what your dad did, it changed things here. I went through the certification last month. 60 hours. It was the hardest thing I've done in this job and the most important." She processed their boarding passes, checked their bags through with the efficiency of someone who does this well and knows it, and then handed the passes over with both hands the way you hand something to someone when you understand that it represents more than what it appears to be. "Have a beautiful flight," she said. "And will you tell your father? Thank you from all of us." Layla took the boarding pass and felt something catch in her throat, a tightening not painful. The physical experience of being seen correctly by a stranger after a long period of being seen incorrectly, of being handed something with both hands by someone who understood what it was worth. She nodded because she didn't trust her voice completely, and they walked toward security. At the TSA checkpoint, a different agent was on duty. A man in his 30s who waved them through the scanner with the brisk professionalism of someone doing his job without editorializing, who watched the green light register, without reaching for latex gloves, who nodded when their bags came off the belt, clean and untouched, and waved them on their way. 30 seconds, no additional screening, no questions, no blue gloves. 2 passengers treated the way every passenger deserves to be treated, as people who are exactly where they are supposed to be. They made their way to gate C-14 and sat down in the seats where 6 months ago they had watched the departure board flip to amber and understood for the first time who their father really was. Imani opened her journal. She opened it to a fresh page. The journal was nearly full, the leather spine cracked deeply. Now the pages thick with 6 months of daily writing, a record of everything she had seen and felt and understood from the morning. Derek Holloway crumpled their boarding passes to write now, a testimony written one entry at a time in the specific and careful handwriting of someone who understands that words are how you make a thing yours, how you keep it from being taken. She put her pen to the page and wrote, "6 months ago, I sat in this exact seat and felt smaller than I have ever felt in my life. A woman put on blue gloves and read my private words in front of a crowd of strangers. And I stood perfectly still and let it happen because I knew we both knew that the moment we reacted, we would become the problem. Today I'm sitting in the same seat, and the only word I have for what I feel is enormous. Not because of what happened to me, because of what happened after." Layla read over her sister's shoulder and didn't say anything. She put her arm around Imani and pulled her close and held her there, the two of them leaning into each other the way they had leaned into each other their entire lives. Weight distributed equally between them, neither one carrying more than the other. The boarding call came at 9:22, and they stood and gathered their things and walked to the gate agent, who scanned their passes with a smile and said, "Welcome aboard," and meant it, and they walked down the jetway and turned left and settled into seats, 2A and 2B. Leather seats, warm towels that arrived before they had finished stowing their bags, a flight attendant who offered water and asked if there was anything else she could bring them before the door closed. Layla looked at the window. The Atlanta morning was clear, the sky the particular shade of blue that only exists at high altitude, and below it the specific blue that makes you feel like distance is a gift rather than a loss. She pulled out her phone and texted her father. "Dad, we made it. First class. No problems. No questions. No one crumpling anything. Just 2 girls on a plane the way it always should have been. We love you." In his office in downtown Atlanta, 39 floors above the city where he had started everything, Nathan Ellis read the text 4 times. Then he set his phone face down on his desk, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. The quarterly report was waiting. The board meeting was in 50 minutes. The West Coast expansion had been back on track for 6 weeks. There were 11 things demanding his attention before noon. He gave none of them the next 30 seconds. He thought about Layla's voice cracking on the phone 6 months ago. That specific fracture, the one only a parent can hear, and the way that sound had made every other thing in his world go silent and irrelevant. He thought about Victoria Strand's blue gloves and the snap of them. He thought about Derek Holloway's face when he understood who he had humiliated. He thought about 3,847 names in a database that nobody had ever read until he made them read it. He thought about the young man in the law school sweatshirt whose father had shined floors for 28 years and never stopped telling his son to go further. And then he thought about his mother, Evelyn Ellis, 78 years old, still in the house in Savannah where Nathan had grown up, still sharp and direct and capable of saying the thing that cut cleanest, who had called him the night after the interview aired and said, "Your grandfather worked in a whites-only terminal for 23 years, Nathan." He shined shoes. He wasn't allowed to sit in the waiting area. He wasn't allowed to use the main bathroom. He came home every single night with polish on his hands, and he never once complained. He just said one day it'll be different for them. He didn't live to see it. But I did. Last night I watched my son shut down an entire airline because he refused to let his children be treated the way his grandfather was treated. And I need you to hear me say this: your grandfather is proud of you. I am proud of you. Now be proud of yourself, baby. You've earned it. Nathan picked up his phone and typed 3 words back to his daughter. Fly high, baby. At 37,000 feet somewhere over Tennessee, Layla read the text and smiled the full, unguarded, room-lighting smile from the Christmas photo on her father's phone, the one that had been looking at him from the caller ID the morning everything started. She turned to Imani, who was writing again, pen moving in steady, confident strokes across the page, the journal nearly full, the last pages filling with everything this day was. "What are you writing?" Layla asked. The ending, Imani said without looking up. Ending of what our story? All of it from the moment Derek took our boarding passes to right now, this exact moment, 37,000 feet in the air. Layla looked out the window at the clouds below them, infinite and white, and impossibly vast, the whole curve of the earth visible at the edges of the view, the world enormous and still and continuing. "How does it end?" she asked. Imani stopped writing. She looked up at her sister, the quiet, knowing expression that had always been hers, the look of someone who has been watching a thing carefully long enough to understand it all the way through. "It doesn't end," Imani said. "That's the whole point. What Dad started, what we started, it doesn't get an ending. It just becomes part of what's possible. It becomes everybody's story." Layla took her sister's hand. Imani held it. And two black girls flew first class at 37,000 feet, the way it always should have been over a country that was still becoming what it had promised to be. Not all the way there. Not yet. But moving changed in the specific and indelible way that things change when someone with the power to look away decides not to. When someone with the power to manage a thing decides instead to mean it, when a father loves his daughters enough to stop the whole world and refuse to restart it until the world agrees to be better. Below them, in terminals across America, things were different. Not everything, not perfectly, but genuinely, measurably, documentably different. Because 3,847 complaints had finally been read, because 60 hours of honest reckoning had been required of people who needed to do the reckoning, because a man had picked up a phone one Tuesday morning and made a decision that could not be undone and was not meant to be. And in seat 2, Alayla Ellis leaned her head back and looked at the sky and thought that her father had been right about one thing all along, even if the reason for it had not been what she thought. Don't tell anyone who your dad is, not because the name didn't matter, because she needed to know first who she was. Now she knew. And nothing, not a gate agent with sandy blonde hair and a counterfeit smile. Not a checkpoint and blue latex gloves. Not a small room and 11 minutes of questions without cause. Nothing was ever going to take that from her again.